and welcome to this Nobel Conference preview event. We're looking forward to an exciting conference in just a few short weeks, Making Food Good. And members of the planning committee wanted the community to share the excitement we're feeling. We hope that everyone still remembers some of the ideas discussed at Nobel Conference 43, Heating Up the Energy Debate, and last fall's conference, H2O Uncertain Resource. And we thought in the true spirit of the liberal arts that it would be good to explore the connections between these important ideas of energy, water, and food. So to that end, we've invited an expert in the area who happens to live in the area and work in our area to light, or relight if you want, the Nobel Conference fire. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Donche, Director of the Johnson Center for Environmental Innovation, to introduce Dr. C. Ford Runge. Before I do that, I want to note, in case I don't remember to do it after the talk, up front we have a few items for you if you're interested. The Nobel Conference magazine, Making Food Good, is up front on the table. There are a few posters, and there are some books up here, and Judy is here to help you make your selections of books if you want. So after the talk, we'll have some opportunity for some questions and some discussion and some food, and which maybe seems appropriate. But without further ado, Jim.
When I realized I was going to get to do this introduction, I thought, what a wonderful chance. Many years ago, I encountered a small poem that mentions corn, and it also has a local connection. The author, Heidi Anixted, has family connections to this area. And I will use that as a preface to my remarks about Dr. Runge. Definite fall. Today is a definite fall. Rise in the wind, downward trends of leaves, lift in a loafing stroll of summer. Pale sun on dark sky, dichotomies and turns flying south, migrating angels, curving in graph paper perfection of turns and plains, flying south over Iowa plains, of corn, of course, definitely autumn. Of corn, of course. When future naturalists, historians, and archaeologists decipher the natural history of the American Midwest, and indeed the world, they will have to reckon with the natural history of corn. From its origins in the Midwest, or in the Americas, Zea mays has spread out throughout the world to become an integral part of its adopted cultures. So much so that when I asked subsistence farmer friends in West Africa about the origins of the corn they grew, they insisted that the corn, of course, was one of their crops and always had been. When European settlers squeezed through the Cumberland Gap and other Appalachian mountain passes and needed a crop that produced liquid cash, corn, of course, in the form of whiskey, was a readily marketable commodity. The end result was that corn, of course, became the dominant crop that replaced the native prairie throughout the Midwest, wherever there's enough rainfall or irrigation water to make a crop. Now, when we ask what our meat, our snack food, our drinks, our fuel, and in some cases even our plastic, are made of, the answer is corn, of course. As fall harvest commences across southern Minnesota, you will see veritable mountains of golden corn spring up across the prairie. The sheer volume of corn is such that in many places, the grain elevators have long been supplanted by large open piles of corn. But that corn, of course, doesn't stay put. It soon begins to flow from those piles to feedlots and processing plants, beginning a distribution that reaches around the world. As a result, the title of today's talk, Rivers of Gold, Where Does the Corn Flow, and Does It Make Sense, uses a very appropriate metaphor. And our speaker, C. Ford Runge, is a very appropriate person to address where that corn flows. Professor Runge is a professor of applied mathematics and law at the University of Minnesota, where he has an appointment to the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute in Public Affairs, and is subdirector in the Center for International Food and Agricultural Policy, focusing on commodities and trade policy. And since I have already branded him with the charge of associating with lawyers and practicing applied mathematicians, I should also note the other suspect association. He did his master's degree in economics at Oxford University and his Ph.D. work in agricultural economics at the University of Wisconsin. Mathematicians, lawyers, economists. This man runs in a rough academic crowd. Professor Runge, putting aside our academic and personal biases, we are pleased to welcome you to Gustavus and look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've visited Gustavus and Adolphus once before, and it's very nice to be back. I enjoyed the drive down. Mark Twain once famously quipped that everyone talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. The same might be said of food, which is easy to talk about, but difficult to do something about, both individually and socially. Doing something about food and the food we eat in our times involves choices. Something not possible in earlier times when you ate what you got, or not at all. But to understand these choices, we need to understand the bases of the modern food system. And among all others, one of these bases is the role of corn, or what the rest of the world generally refers to as maize. But I'll continue to use the American usage. The cultivation of corn counts as one of the greatest achievements of civilization and examples of cultural sharing in the history of humankind. Most of this activity occurred in the Western Hemisphere beginning some 10,000 years ago. Through a process of controlled evolution beginning in the Central Valley of Mexico, corn has come to define cultures in both the North and the South. What I intend today is to provide you with a four-part discussion. The first is a brief botanical history of this remarkable plant. The second is to discuss the varieties of value added to this plant by its further use and the situation in terms of that use today. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about estimates that we have made of the value added to corn by different end uses. And finally, I'd like to close with a closer look at the growing use of this plant to produce liquid fuels in the form of ethanol. Corn's exact botanical origins are shrouded in historical time and are still the subject of debate. In 1961, the archaeologist R.S. McNeish found a cave site in Mexico with half-inch cobs, estimated at 7,200 years of age by carbon-14 dating. In 1976, Rafael Guzman of the University of Guadalajara discovered a wild perennial, teosinte, that, like corn, was a diploid, that is to say, had 20 chromosomes, and could therefore be crossbred with corn, in principle. Late in life, the corn breeder and scientist Paul Mangelsdorf, who died in 1989, while in retirement from Harvard University at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, successfully crossbred teosinte with Zea maize, concluding that it was historically probable that the two had co-evolved. At least 3 U.S. founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, grew and wrote about corn. A Washington-Jefferson correspondence noted the practice at Mount Vernon of alternating rows of 2 New World crops, corn and potatoes. From 1825 to 1850, railroad expansion cut the time it took to transport produce and material from New York to Chicago from 3 weeks to less than 2 days, and a fan-shaped pattern of rail lines converged from the states surrounding Chicago to Chicago itself, defining what would become known as the Corn Belt. The expanding railroad network also carried speakers on the rear platforms called seed corn gospel trains, offering seed samples to encourage more corn and more freight tonnage. From the mid-19th century onward, Chicago was the epicenter of the price discovery process for this globally priced commodity. The 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition featured a special exhibit of Reed's yellow dent corn. Corn is roughly divided into flints and dents to depending on whether the kernels are round or indented. This variety, which was then known as World's Fair corn, and an offspring, Dorr's Yellow Dent, came to dominate the fields of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana by the turn of the 20th century. In 1926, Henry Wallace founded his own firm, the Hybrid Company, which in 1935 changed its name to Pioneer. Today, Pioneer, now owned by DuPont, remains at the center of the agricultural production research enterprise. The hybridization of corn, which was led by the Wallace Company, has been largely responsible, together with improvements in tillage, weed control, fertilization, and irrigation, for remarkable increases in average yields. It's estimated that historically, Native American corn yields averaged 20 bushels per acre. Yields did not rise above this level with any frequency until the third decade after 1900. In 1937, an exceptional year, the average was 40 bushels an acre, twice as much. From 1949 to 1964, productivity increases pushed yields to an average of 38.2 bushels per acre, and then by 1964, 62 bushels per acre. By 1985, average yields were 118 bushels per acre. By 2000, 137 bushels per acre, and 2009's average is projected at 165.2 bushels per acre. Over 50% of corn planted today is derived from just half a dozen major cultivars, making the crop vulnerable to epidemics, such as nearly occurred in the early 1970s because of the narrow genetic pool from which these cultivars are drawn. So, to conclude my brief botanical history, the history of corn production began in the New World, but is defined in the modern era by the production methods of the U.S. Corn Belt, where technology and human ingenuity, aided by applied science, has resulted in a system of production that is the envy of agricultural producers everywhere. Let me turn now to the situation today and varieties of value added to this plant, nearly every part of which is of some potential commercial use. Today, the United States is the largest producer, processor, and exporter of corn in the world, accounting for 41% of world production and 60% of global exports. In 2008, Iowa was the leading producing state, followed by Illinois, Nebraska, Minnesota in the fourth place, and Indiana. This corn is used to make literally thousands of other products, from livestock feed to plastics, biofuels to vitamin C, breakfast cereals to high fructose corn syrup. I have, and I realize that this is sort of overkill, but I have selected approximately 150 of these uses for your examination. We can start here with the uses of corn starches, largely for industrial use. Of course, I don't expect you to commit these to memory, but I'm just going to run through them as a way of demonstrating to you how remarkably diverse the end uses of this plant are. These are the starches, starch complexes. These are the syrup uses. Take a look at that for a second. These are the uses of dextrose. I'll be discussing each of these subcomponents in more detail in a minute. These are more food and other uses of starches and dextrose. More uses for syrups. More uses for dextrose. And of course, last, and the subject to which I'm going to return, the use of corn to make liquid alcohol fuel, which would be drinkable, but for the fact that the liquor industry insists that it be poisoned, so that it can't be drunk. Now, in sort of crude terms, corn uses are divided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture into three broad categories: feed and residual use, alcohol for fuel use, and other food, seed, and industrial uses. What I'd like to draw your attention to in this figure is that since 2003, these categories have seen major adjustments, with corn ethanol, which is the yellow portion of that diagram, accounting for a larger and larger share of end use. And I'll return to the underlying question of this presentation toward its conclusion, but that underlying question is the larger and larger claim on the quantity of corn represented by ethanol, corn ethanol, and the loss in its use for the blue category, feed and residual use, a way in which we are maximizing the value and economic impact of this remarkable bounty, or is it not? Each of the end uses of corn represents, then, its own market, linked to factors that determine the prices and quantities in that market. And I'll give you some examples here. This lesson is about ready to leave botany, history, and enter into the unpleasant part of the talk, which is economics. But let me proceed anyway. The price and quantity of cornstarch, for example, is determined by the demand for starch in food, drug, and industrial uses, and the conditions that affect substitutes for corn starch, such as potato starch. Now, some of these markets, although few, are ruled solely by the forces of supply and demand, unaffected by monopoly power or government policies. But that's the exception, not the rule. High fructose corn syrup, for example, which has now been given a new name by the corn refiners, corn sugar, a little less daunting, I suppose, is nominally traded based on how much corn is diverted to make it, the supply side, and the demand for it in the food industry, for sweeteners. But that's not the whole story. The sweeteners market includes sugar, cane and beet sugar, which is a close substitute for high fructose corn syrup. And sugar supply, cane and beet sugar supply, is restricted in the United States by government quotas on importing countries, the effect of which is to hold the price of corn and beet sugar at or above 18 cents a pound by law. This mandated restriction in supply keeps domestic U.S. prices above those of lower-priced foreign sugar. But it also, and this is the critical point, allows high fructose corn syrup producers to sell their sugar at prices that could not be competitive, absent the sugar quotas. The corn plant, then, is affected not only by market forces, but by a whole array of government policies that influence where and how it flows. Absent the sugar quotas, high fructose corn syrup would not be an attractive alternative use. Let me return for a minute to describe the corn plant as remarkable, because every part of it is of some use. Not only the grain, but the leaves and the stalks and the tassels, and even the cobs are used to make thousands of food and non-food products. These uses can be divided further into direct human consumption, feed ingredients for forage for livestock, and those products which derive from one of two milling processes: wet milling for starch and sweeteners, and dry milling for cereals, brewing, and other uses. And finally, fermentation and distilling, We generally understand, even if we're not involved in this sector, that it's as a feed grain that corn is most widely used, accounting for about 2/3 of all utilization on a global scale. The reason that it's expected currently that China will soon begin increasing major quantities of U.S., or importing major quantities of U.S. corn, is to feed the huge population of pigs living in China. As hog feed, as cattle feed, and as poultry feed, corn has its widest use. As I mentioned, about 2/3 of all utilization on a global scale of corn is for animal feed. Of all cereal grains, corn provides the highest levels of energy conversion of dry substance to meat and milk and eggs, making it the feed grain of choice in formulated feeds. It can be fed as a shelled grain after removal from the cob, as cracked shelled grain, or can be steam flaked and mixed with other feed ingredients, vitamins and minerals, to achieve an optimal balance for the type of livestock and feeding program that's desired. Now let me turn to the question of how each of these different transformations of corn into alternative products add value to the input of corn itself. While in some cases this transformation is minimal, for example, drying and delivery for feed, in other cases it's quite substantial. For example, when corn dextrose is converted to plastic or vitamin C. The result is a particular submarket. So an economist would say that the demand for corn is derived from the demand for things like vitamin C or bioplastics or animal feed. The question is, what is the value added by the particular end use? And in order to estimate this value-added function, we need to know the value of corn as an input, the cost of transforming it into something else, and the value of that into which it is transformed. But it's an oversimplification to imagine that a bushel of corn can go anywhere and become anything for 3 reasons. First, once an industrial or fuel or feed use of corn becomes established in a particular geographic area, it will attract nearby corn with a kind of gravitational pull. Iowa, apart from being the single largest state producer of corn, is also close to being the epicenter of the ethanol industry. Hence, corn has a shorter distance to travel from Iowa fields to ethanol plants than elsewhere, reducing its so-called basis costs or transportation costs as a biofuel feedstock. So it will be drawn from Iowa fields to ethanol plants as a matter of basic economics. Secondly, corn transformation involves what economists call irreversibilities or path dependencies. Put very simply, once you decide to do a particular thing with a bushel of corn, it sets you on a path that may determine further end uses. For example, corn can be dry milled or wet milled. Dry milling is the older method, based on physically grinding dried kernels. Dry milling, in contrast to wet milling, results from cleaning and drying corn kernels, raising moisture levels to 20%, removing the germ, and drying the remaining endosperm, which is known as the tail hominy fraction. Some of this is isolated to make flakes used in breakfast cereals, while further separation leads to smaller grits, meals, and corn flours. The bran and germ are separated and used for oil, hominy, feed, and bran. Corn may also be dry milled by stone grinding, as in the use of white grain for hominy grits or cornmeal, which results in an oily flour that retains the nutritional value of the germ and the bran, but reduces its capacity to be stored as flour because it spoils due to its oil content. As in the use of white corn for tortillas, lime steeping can precede grinding to produce a flour useful in corn chips and snack items. Either yellow dent corn or white corn can be used as a basis of dry milling. Dry milling actually accounts for only about 2% of U.S. corn production, although its products are well known to consumers, such as cornflakes, or corn for brewing and other food uses. But the real action in terms of the fractionation and processing of corn occurs in wet milling, which produces a much wider range of co-products and sets corn refining on a particular path. Wet milling separates the corn kernel by first soaking and swelling it, during which nutrients are absorbed by the water. This steep water, as it's known, is drawn off, condensed, and the maize germ is separated from the kernel. The germ is then pressed to remove corn oil, and the remaining meal is retained to be used as a feed ingredient. The remaining starch, gluten, and bran in the kernel are then screened. The bran is removed, and the starch and gluten are placed in large centrifuges and separated. The starch is dried and used in food, paper, textiles, and adhesives, among many other uses. The corn gluten becomes a very nutritious feed ingredient. The steep water produced in the initial stages of wet milling also provides a culture medium in which antibiotics can be produced. Corn oil produced from the germ is widely used in cooking and for margarine because it's high in polysaturates. Recently, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has developed corn starch combinations capable of soaking up 2,000 times their own weight in moisture, which have been rapidly adopted to diapers and fuel fillers. So, let me turn to the question of how much value is added by different transformations of corn and by category. The first part of calculating the value added from processing a bushel of corn, which is the cost of the raw product, is easy to obtain. Every day, the price of corn is posted on the Chicago Board of Trade, which, when adjusted for transportation, or basis as it's known, establishes its local market price. So the market price in Mankato will be less than the price in Chicago due to this transportation differential. Some of the users of corn buy daily in the cash market, but most forward contract and use options contracts and futures markets to fix a price for future delivery. I won't get into the question of how these markets function, but in principle it's possible to establish a forward price so that you know what you're going to be selling corn for, even before you've planted. Of course, these markets can also be used for speculative purposes if you're only on the long or the short side, but that's another story. The next step in calculating value added is to find the prices at which processed outputs will sell. Monthly historical prices are available from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and daily and weekly prices are also available at USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. The third piece of information is the amount of product that can be produced from one bushel of corn, and this is perhaps the most difficult to obtain. But with the help of my very able graduate research assistant, we've developed an approach to this which I think is reasonably accurate. These are some of the end uses that I described a few minutes ago, and these are the particular end uses for which we've isolated the value-added calculations that I'll report in a minute. Corn gluten feed, distiller's grain for legal drinkable alcohol, corn starch, high fructose corn syrup, corn meal, corn syrup, corn gluten meal, corn oil, ethanol, and dextrose. And the next thing I want to show you is the simple way in which value added is calculated from this data. The price of the output minus the price of corn times the yield per unit of corn. Now, let me turn to value-added calculations for several of these corn-derived products. And shortly I'll explain what may appear slightly counterintuitive, that the value added for corn gluten feed, corn gluten meal, corn oil, and distiller's grain is negative. Setting that question aside for a moment, look at the positive lines for ethanol, cornstarch, corn meal, high fructose corn syrup, and dextrose. and observe that the increase in value for ethanol is 21%, and that this rises steadily from 21% to a high of 171.4% for dextrose. Okay, now why are some of these numbers negative? The reason is that when a bushel of corn is processed through the wet or dry milling process, it separates into 5 primary products: steep water, germ, fiber, gluten, and starch. And each of these can then be processed into various outputs. The key point is that in each of the final products, which can only be created from one of the primary products, we have complexes, let's call them, of products or bundles of products, some of which may have negative value relative to the others, but clearly none of which would be pursued if the net value was not positive. So we've divided these into 5 product bundles: ethanol, distiller's grain, etc., cornstarch, etc., high fructose corn syrup, and so on, corn syrup, and dextrose. These are all, you might say, kindred, depending on the decision or path that's taken to further process corn. Note again that the bundles and their value added now all appear positive, and that at the low end, at 192% of value added, is the complex associated with ethanol, distiller's grain, CGF, CGM, and corn oil. And at the high end, with dextrose and its kindred products. So this is the only important, I think, observation to be drawn from these calculations, which I have to admit were rather onerous to perform. But the bottom line here is that we're ranking the value added by these different complexes. To give you just a little bit of further insight into this, you can see how the wet milling process fractionates the uses of corn into different final products. Now, one thing, and this is an important caveat for the calculations that I presented to you, is that the value added in each of these products and each of these complexes of products can change fairly dramatically over time as the parameters in that simple equation that I presented shift due to market and other conditions. So, for example, if we look at the value added over time for single products, you can see that there is a reasonable degree of variance in these value added calculations over a period of time. This is calculated from 1980 to 2008. And the same is true in the product bundles that I described. So what we've done in estimating the value added numbers that I reported to you in those tables is to average the value added over the period of time in question, so that these are averages subject to coefficients of variation that in some cases are fairly large. All right, so let me turn now to the last set of observations that I'd like to make, and they have to do, based on all that I've described to you in terms of what might not have been a terribly exciting description of corn processing, about the value added in each of these subcategories, and the question of, are we maximizing corn's value? And this is very important from the point of view of both private welfare, that is to say the value added to Minnesota's most important field crop, and public welfare insofar as certain of the uses of corn are the result of subsidies paid by U.S. taxpayers to a much greater extent than some of the other uses. So there's both a private and a public dimension to the question of whether or not we are maximizing the value of the use of this magnificent plant. The U.S. is currently devoting approximately 25% of this year's record 4.53 billion bushel corn crop to ethanol. The market for ethanol would not exist absent government subsidies. Even if every bushel of corn the U.S. produced were dedicated to biofuels, it would, furthermore, support only about 15% of vehicular energy demand. The most intrusive form of subsidies are usage mandates known as the Renewable Fuel Standard, which have diverted corn from food and feed to fuel use, regardless of supply conditions or price levels. Under 2007 energy legislation, use of biofuels is mandated to rise to 36 billion gallons by 2022, including 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol. President Obama's proposal has been, although this has not been enacted into law, to raise this mandate from 36 billion gallons by 2022 to 60 billion gallons by 2030. One expert, Douglas Koplow, estimates that if current laws are maintained until 2022, the biofuels industry will receive more than $60 billion in subsidies per year, a six-fold increase over the $9.5 billion in support received in 2008. Cumulative subsidies between 2018 and 2022 are expected to total $420 billion. If the Obama plan, mandating 60 billion gallons by 2030, comes to pass, subsidies in that year will be $125 billion, and the cumulative support from 2008 to 2030 will be in excess of $1 trillion to produce biofuels. Now, in principle, the mandated use of biofuels derived from corn is to top out at 15 billion gallons. So how will the rest of the mandate be met? Well, under the law, the rest of the mandate is to be met from cellulosic biofuels derived from feedstocks other than corn, the most popular of which seems to be switchgrass, none of which I saw growing between here and Twin Cities. That may be an important point because this year's mandated cellulosic blend had to be scaled back by 95% because the cellulosic fuel was simply commercially unavailable. U.S. production capacity for cellulosic fuels was estimated in 2010 to be only 10 million gallons. The mandate called for 100 million gallons. The USDA has recently analyzed the costs of cellulosic ethanol to be 3 to 4 times those of corn ethanol plants, and noted that the costs of growing feedstocks for cellulosic plants are likely underestimates, and that dedicated energy crops would need to compete with the lowest value crops, such as hay, which has a price exceeding $100 per ton. The leading cellulosic ethanol producer, a company called Fiberite, is expected to have a production capacity of 130 barrels a day in 2010. Even a small oil refinery produces 60,000 barrels a day. Production capacity for cellulosic biofuel is forecasted by USDA at 291.4 million gallons by 2012. The mandate in that year, under the legislation, is 1,000 million gallons, a billion gallons. This analysis suggests two clear conclusions. First, the value added to corn by transforming it to ethanol is lower than numerous other value-added transformations. Second, this transformation is predicated entirely on subsidies in which the American taxpayer is done for billions of dollars each year. Does this make sense? From the point of view of private value added, or from the point of view of the public interest? The answer is no. Thank you.
I think Professor Runge would take a few questions.
Are
Yes.
your calculations for the number of subsidies that will be in the future compared to, like, for the gas prices? Are those dependent on increasing oil prices or the oil prices of today? Or
No. No. I think what you're getting at. The question was, are my calculations on the subsidy costs sensitive to the relative price of petroleum fuel, right? You have an interesting point, which is that the market economics of ethanol production, the profitability or the margins that you get from producing ethanol, will be sensitive to the price of the substitute, which is gasoline. So the higher oil and gasoline prices, the more profitable it will be to produce ethanol. But I should add that the effect of that will be that ethanol producers under a regime of high oil or gas prices can afford to pay more for corn to produce ethanol. So the impact of an increase in oil and gasoline prices will be to raise the price of corn, which will reduce the margins to producing ethanol because corn is the feedstock. So the profitability of producing ethanol is a function of the relative price of oil. The higher the better for ethanol producers, and the price of corn. The lower the better for ethanol producers. But since the price of corn now seems to is co-integrated, you would say, or is positively correlated with the price of petroleum and oil, as that price of oil and petroleum goes up, the price of corn is going to go up too. However, to answer your question directly, the calculations that we made with respect to the cost to taxpayers of subsidizing biofuels are purely based on the volume of biofuels mandated to be produced. And since since the subsidies are volumetric, in other words, the more produced, the more subsidy has to be paid, the subsidy paid will simply scale up with the total quantity of ethanol that's mandated to be produced, and that's independent of the price of petroleum and gasoline. Did I answer your question?
yeah.
Yes.
Having only a few companies controlling the corn products, does that raise or lower the price of the
Question?
seed itself, like Monsanto and ADM?
Well, the seed.
Yeah. So does this keep the price of corn high or low?
Well, okay. Let me first of all say that the cost of corn is going to be a function of a whole variety of things that go into growing it, of which the cost of seed is one. Seed costs as a proportion of total costs are important, but not determinative. If we isolate the question of the seed market per se, and ask whether or not, because that seed market is dominated to a much greater extent than it used to be by a relatively small number of companies, then you might ask, is there monopsony power being exercised in that market by these few companies such that the price of seed is higher than it would be if the industry were less concentrated? Is that a reasonable way of putting your question? And I think the answer is probably, but I think that it may be that these companies' costs of seed are also reflecting the introduction of genetically modified traits into this seed, for which so-called technology premiums are charged to farmers. And those premiums are easier to extract from a monopsony position than they would be in the absence of that monopsony. In the 1990s, commercial GM varieties were introduced in 1996. And in the early 1990s and throughout the remainder of the decade, both in anticipation of the introduction of these GM traits, the two most important of which were glyphosate tolerance, Roundup Ready, and BT, resistance to corn rootworm. The large companies began to acquire many of the smaller seed companies like DeKalb and Asgrow and so on. And you could see the signs driving down the road. So that the bigger companies, such as Northrop King, which is owned by Syngenta, or Pioneer, DuPont, etc., were in a position to control more of the germplasm that was contained in the seed varieties that had been hybridized by these smaller companies. And this was motivated substantially by the development of these GM traits, so that there was a kind of a run on germplasm that occurred in the mid-1990s, and I think this tended to reinforce the concentration of the seed business. It's always difficult to know, in those kind of situations, how much that concentration is leading to monopsony. I think that, on the buy side of the market, we refer to monopolistic competition, and I would characterize the seed market today as monopsonistic competition. So there are elements of monopsony and elements of competition that are going on simultaneously. Monopsony means a small number of sellers. Buyers, yeah. So I'd say a small amount of concentration, but not determined. Yeah.
Could you cast us back about maybe 15 years? First of all, my question comes from the perspective of someone who was not very enthusiastic about ethanol when I came in the room and done nothing to encourage me. But my question is about the fact that there was at least a perception in the popular press, say 15 or 20 years ago, that corn surpluses were creating a situation in which we were finding more and more places in which to stuff high fructose corn syrup in particular. But there was this, at least in the press, there was a sense that we went from a situation in which, maybe it's more recent than 15 years ago, in which there was just way the heck too much corn out there and we better put it in our, sugar, to a situation in which suddenly we're very concerned about the ways in which, as you said, corn use for ethanol is eating into corn use for animal feed. So can you just talk a little bit about whether that perception is very...
Well, yeah, I'm familiar with the general critique. I think Michael Pollan in particular is associated with the idea that surplus corn has driven its use to make sugar, to make other things, and so on. And I think it is fair to say that the abundance of the feedstock has encouraged creativity in its use, which is pretty much what I was attesting to here. And some of its uses are more congenial to some people than others. The debate over high fructose corn syrup versus sugar, is ultimately a debate over biochemistry and metabolism. And it's not really my field, but from what I know about it, I think that the process of conversion to high fructose corn syrup, unless it can be shown that HFCS is metabolized differently than glucose or fructose from cane sugar and so on, sugar is sugar. But eating too much sugar, no matter what its source is not good for the human metabolism. To answer your question on HFCS, I actually think that the real reason we're producing so much HFCS is the sugar subsidy, which I talked about before. Absent of those quotas on foreign sugar, we wouldn't be. I didn't touch on it in the case of ethanol, but apart from the mandates and tax credits that we give the ethanol sector, which is what I was totting up in those numbers, we impose a 54-cent a gallon tariff on imported ethanol, most of which comes from Brazil and which is made from sugarcane. Brazilian sugarcane-based ethanol can be produced for about 50 cents on the dollar relative to corn-based ethanol in the Midwest, hence the 54 cent a gallon tariff that we impose on it. And I haven't talked about trade policy here. I've talked about sort of private decision-making and tax policy implicitly. But you know, if you teach a course in trade economics like I do, you explain to students that some countries have a strong comparative advantage in producing certain things and they don't in others. So you know, bananas would not be Minnesota's forte. If there's any crop in America and in the Corn Belt in which we have an indisputed comparative advantage, it's number 2 yellow corn. So we take number 2 yellow corn and we put it through a complex and costly transformation process to generate ethanol. And lo and behold, we're doing it at twice the cost that the Brazilians can produce ethanol with sugar. So we have to impose a 54 cent a gallon tariff on imported ethanol. A clear demonstration of our comparative advantage in ethanol production, disadvantage in ethanol production. So we take a crop in which we have a comparative advantage, transform it into a product ethanol in which we have a comparative disadvantage, and then have to protect the domestic industry with a 54 cent a gallon tariff. I mean, as trade policy, that's pretty crazy. Just one more comment on Brazilian sugar-based ethanol. I was talking to Syngenta's head of operations in Sao Paulo, head of the Latin American division, 2 days ago on the phone. And he explained to me that Syngenta and the John Deere Company have developed a new planting method for sugarcane in Brazil and some new equipment that Deere is designing that will reduce the number of people required to plant sugarcane in Brazil from 118 people per hectare to 2. The estimate is that the cost of production of sugar-based ethanol in Brazil are going to drop by half again. That will put it at 1/4 the cost of U.S. corn-based ethanol. And if that logic follows the same route that I just described, we'll have to raise our tariff against Brazilian ethanol to protect our markets. But you know, in a general sense, I think the fact that we have an enormous quantity of this very versatile commodity is good. But the more refined question is, are we making the best use of it? And the thrust of my remarks has been, I don't think we are.
Economically, we're not. Right?
Right.
Economically, it's not a good use. There's 116 Brazilian workers that then are going to be unemployed by this technology. You know, so the human cost dimension in this is another realm that is kind of out of your talk today.
Well, I'd be happy to address that. I mean, go ahead.
Oh, well, you know, with what you're saying, I'm wondering, are farmers out there still going to be producing more and more corn for ethanol, or is it going to kind of go down in terms of its production?
Okay, well, to answer your last part of your question first, it's mandated to go up. It's mandated under law to go up. So unless the mandates are drawn off, the answer is yes, they will be. Now, the mandate, as I said, in principle, cuts out for corn at 15 billion gallons. We're at about 12 now. And that's why there's tremendous agitation over the EPA discussion regarding whether or not we're going to move the requirements for ethanol blending from E10 to E85. This is what's referred to in the industry as the blend wall. And if we can get through that blend wall, then we'll increase the aggregate demand for corn-based ethanol in ways that will be less constrained by this 15 billion gallon ceiling. As to the unemployment consequences of innovation in agriculture, you know, the experience of the United States has been that from a period in the 1920s in which almost half of the U.S. labor force was engaged in some form of agricultural employment, to today when it's less than 2%. the process of mechanization and the substitution of capital and chemicals for labor has caused a huge outmigration from agriculture to other occupations. And this experience has been repeated in the modernization of virtually every country that we know. Brazil is currently in the process of emerging as a mature agricultural power. And as a result, it will also shed labor from the agricultural sector. Are the 116 people who will no longer be needed to plant sugarcane necessarily worse off? It depends on what their alternative form of employment is. What they're doing now is not particularly attractive. So if they can be absorbed in other sectors of the Brazilian economy, they may be better off. But the fact that, I'll leave you with just sort of maybe two final thoughts. The first is that the process of technical change in agriculture is disruptive to the agricultural labor market. That's a reality. And the illusion that we can maintain agriculture in a steady state of technology, whether circa 1990 or 1750 or 1920 or 1940, is just that. It's an illusion. Secondly, inherently, when you are as aggressive in manipulating the soil and the land and the biosphere, the ecology of farm fields, or converting land from forests to fields, you are engaged in a very ecologically disruptive process. Agriculture is an aggressively ecologically disruptive process, and it always will be. And that's why we have to be so attentive to the unnecessary environmental damages and costs that agriculture can lead to. Because it's easy for that to happen. It's a very, very violent thing, even though it may seem bucolic to watch a tractor and a plow turn earth over in the spring, less so in the fall now that we have conservation tillage. It's a violent process.
I think we have time for one more question, but folks should recognize that there's also the research symposium going on. But go ahead, Mark.
I was wondering if you could speculate, if we took away the sugar subsidies and the ethanol mandates, how that would affect the landscape of rural Minnesota, and then maybe what are the political chances of that happening? I mean, you seem to advocate for getting rid of the sugar subsidies.
Yeah. Okay, well, I can tell you the direction that it would push in or point toward. It wouldn't, first of all, well, okay, it's a thought experiment, right? So let's just treat it as one. If you eliminated the sugar quotas, the U.S. price of sugar would fall to approach the world price. Now, the relationship between those two prices varies, but at times the U.S. price has been as much as 4 times the world price. So as those prices equalize, the consequence would be that the high-cost sugar producers in the United States would go out of business. And only those who were most competitive would remain. So a different price-driven, but same sort of phenomenon. The most high-cost sugar producers in the United States are cane producers in the Delta and in Florida. That would probably materially improve the environmental conditions in the Everglades. Actually, beet sugar producers in Minnesota are some of the lower-cost sugar producers in the United States. Could they sustain this equalization in prices? Perhaps. But I would suspect that it would push against the commitment of Minnesota's fields, especially in the Red River Valley, to sugar beets and their reconversion to wheat, barley, and at the margin, corn and soybeans. The effect of eliminating the mandates would be to push in the direction of less emphasis on corn monoculture and reversion to more traditional rotations of corn and soybeans to both diversify risk and also to make use of the nitrogen fixing properties of leguminous soybean plants. So in general, I would say that the elimination of both would be to encourage greater cropping diversity and the more diverse use of cropland. But it would, not occur overnight.
Let's thank Professor Runge one more time.